In the final spring of the Second World War, Okinawa was no longer an island of quiet fishing villages and terraced fields. It had become one of the bloodiest landscapes of the 20th century, a scar of coral, mud, and shattered trees, where the United States and Imperial Japan fought their last great battle before the shadow of Hiroshima. The air still smelled of gunpowder and decay when the shooting stopped. Rows of American tents spread across the island's hills like white scars. Beyond them, barbed wire enclosed thousands of Japanese prisoners of war, the defeated remnants of an army that had once sworn to die rather than surrender. And yet, within that unlikely cage of defeat, something extraordinary took place. A moment that few remembered and even fewer believed could happen amid the wreckage of war. By late June 1945, the Battle of Okinawa had ended in silence and smoke. American engineers began converting the shattered terrain into bases, hospitals, and temporary holding camps for the captured. The prisoners were exhausted, many half-starved, their uniforms shredded and faces hollow from weeks underground. Among them were conscripted farmers, naval laborers, wounded officers, and even local Okinawan civilians caught between two empires. The Americans, equally worn by the campaign, watched these men with a mixture of suspicion and relief. The battle had killed more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians, and the surviving captives seemed like ghosts from that inferno. For the U.S. troops, life after victory settled into routine, endless maintenance, guarding duties, and waiting for orders. Between shifts, soldiers built makeshift ball fields and played baseball with improvised gloves. They staged boxing bouts, volleyball games, and tug-of-war contests to break the monotony. Sports were a way to reclaim sanity after the nightmare of the Shuri Line and the kamikaze raids. The island was a graveyard, but it also became a strange stage for human renewal. It was in one of these camps, near a dusty plateau overlooking the Pacific, that a small group of Japanese prisoners began to draw circles in the dirt. At first, the American guards thought they were simply cleaning the ground, but the men were tracing a perfect ring 15 feet across, the sacred shape of a dojo, a sumo arena. Within days, more prisoners gathered, flattening the surface with makeshift tools, arranging straw ropes around the circle's edge. They had found an echo of home inside captivity. Sumo, the sport of the gods, had been part of Japanese military culture for centuries. Many soldiers trained in it before conscription. Others saw it as a ritual of discipline and respect. For them, wrestling inside that ring was not only competition, but purification, a return to dignity after surrender. Word of the strange activity spread quickly. Curious American soldiers leaned on the fences to watch, laughing at first, then quieting as they realized the seriousness of the scene. The Japanese wrestlers, barefoot and stripped to the waist, moved with deliberate grace. They bowed, clapped, and stomped the ground to drive away evil spirits, exactly as they would have done in a temple arena back home. What began as a small circle of sand became, over the following weeks, a full-fledged event. The Americans, fascinated, cleared an open area for a proper match. They brought wooden planks to mark the boundaries and allowed the prisoners to build a raised platform from crates and soil. Some GIs even offered to photograph the event, seeing it as an odd souvenir of peace. On a humid July afternoon, as the tropical sun beat down, the first and only sumo of peace took place, a contest between men who had been enemies only weeks before. The wrestlers were not professional rikishi. They were farmers and mechanics, clerks and sailors who remembered the rituals of youth. Each bout began with a solemn bow, the tossing of a handful of dust into the air, the thunderous stomp of feet. The spectators, American Marines, Army engineers, Navy medics, and Japanese captives formed a ring around the platform. Some sat on ammunition boxes, others crouched in the shade of jeeps. There was no scoreboard, no flag to raise, no propaganda to serve. There was only the rhythm of bodies colliding, the grunts of effort, and the rising hum of applause that crossed the barbed wire boundary. When one of the larger Japanese wrestlers threw his opponent cleanly onto the sand, a spontaneous cheer erupted from both sides. American soldiers clapped and whistled, while Japanese prisoners bowed slightly in acknowledgment. For a few minutes, the war's hatred dissolved into the raw language of sport. Cameras clicked. Someone tossed a canteen of water toward the victors. Even the camp's officers, watching from a jeep, allowed themselves a rare smile. Behind that simplicity lay deeper meaning. For the Japanese POWs, the match was a way to reclaim honor. In surrender, they had lost not only their weapons, but their identity as warriors. Sumo gave them a controlled space to prove strength without defiance, pride without rebellion. For the Americans, the spectacle was revelation. They had been told for years that Japanese soldiers would never surrender, that they were fanatics incapable of humanity. Watching them laugh and compete challenged that myth more effectively than any speech could. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, shadows stretched across the ring. The final match ended with both wrestlers locked in stalemate, neither yielding ground until exhaustion forced them apart. The crowd, Japanese and American alike, applauded. Then something even more remarkable happened. An American sergeant stepped forward, kicked off his boots, and gestured toward the ring. The prisoners hesitated, then nodded. The sergeant, grinning nervously, squared off against a wiry Japanese fighter. The crowd roared as the two circled. The American was heavier, relying on raw strength. The Japanese moved like water, using balance and technique. When the sergeant was toppled gently onto the sand, the laughter that followed was pure and human. The victors helped him to his feet. No journalist recorded the event officially. It never appeared in newspapers or military communiques. Yet among the men who witnessed it, the memory survived, whispered in letters, mentioned in post-war interviews, later recalled by veterans' associations as one of those strange, luminous moments when war briefly remembered peace. Some photos were rumored to exist, blurred black-and-white snapshots showing bare-chested men in a circle, American helmets in the background. Whether these images were ever archived remains uncertain, but the story persisted in oral history, a fragile proof that empathy can exist even on the edge of hell. After the surrender of Japan in August 1945, the POW camps in Okinawa gradually emptied. Many of the Japanese prisoners were sent to labor duties, helping rebuild airfields or clearing debris. The makeshift sumo ring was dismantled, its ropes used to tie supply crates, its sand scattered by the wind. But among both captors and captives, something intangible remained, a memory of laughter, sweat, and mutual respect. Historians later debated whether the event should be considered apocryphal, a myth born from post-war nostalgia. Yet testimonies from American veterans stationed on Okinawa in mid-1945 tell a consistent tale. That a handful of Japanese POWs indeed organized a sumo exhibition, encouraged by their guards, and that it briefly turned a prison yard into an arena of shared humanity. The broader context of this moment makes it even more astonishing. Okinawa had been a catastrophe, a battle where entire civilian populations were annihilated, where fanaticism met overwhelming firepower. To find any gesture of respect within that carnage seemed impossible, and yet the human need for connection is stubborn. The same men who had tried to kill each other weeks earlier could, under different circumstances, find curiosity instead of hatred. For Japan, sumo was never merely sport. It was ceremony, rooted in Shinto ritual, in the purification of the body and spirit before combat. To the prisoners, stepping into that ring was almost an act of atonement, a way to cleanse themselves of the shame of surrender. For the Americans watching, it offered a glimpse into the soul of a culture they had known only through propaganda posters. It showed them that strength in Japan was not just ferocity, but discipline, balance, and respect. After the war, some of those American soldiers returned home with memories of the event vivid in their minds. One wrote years later that the sight of those Japanese men bowing before the match felt more peaceful than any church service. Others said it changed how they viewed the enemy forever. They had seen not faceless adversaries, but men as weary and human as themselves. Meanwhile, many of the Japanese participants returned home to a devastated nation. Some became teachers, farmers, or laborers in the ruins of Tokyo and Osaka. For them, the memory of the sumo of peace was bittersweet, a moment of dignity amid humiliation. A few kept scraps of rope from the old dohyo as keepsakes. In later decades, when researchers compiled oral histories of Pacific War veterans, snippets of the story resurfaced. It appeared in a 1972 collection of Okinawa recollections by Marine units and in several Japanese memoirs published quietly in the 1980s. None gave full detail, but all agreed on the essence. After one of the deadliest battles in history, there had been laughter between enemies. The symbolic weight of that moment continues to intrigue historians today. It was not an organized propaganda event, not an official ceremony. It emerged spontaneously from shared boredom and curiosity, the most fragile foundation imaginable, yet strong enough to momentarily bridge cultures. In that sense, the sumo match became an unspoken treaty, a microcosm of what peace might mean if stripped of flags and politics. When Japan capitulated on August 15, 1945, the world changed in a single broadcast. Across the Pacific, soldiers in every outpost of the Japanese Empire heard Emperor Hirohito's trembling voice announce the enduring peace of the world. For the prisoners in Okinawa, the words reached through static-filled loudspeakers guarded by men in American uniforms. They bowed their heads, some in relief, some in disbelief. The island, once a place of resistance, now became the first step toward occupation. Within weeks, Okinawa transformed again, from a battlefield to a staging ground for the invasion that never came. The United States poured supplies, engineers, and administrators into the island, turning it into a logistical heart of the Pacific. Airfields stretched where villages had been, hospitals rose on flattened hills, and amid that great machinery of reconstruction, the memories of the strange sumo match began to blend into the rhythm of post-war life. Yet, for many who had witnessed it, the event refused to fade. The American guards who had watched the Japanese wrestlers began to share the story with newcomers, telling it as proof that their former enemies were capable of grace. The tale spread from camp to camp, first as curiosity, then as quiet admiration. Men who had fought at Saipan and Iwo Jima listened and nodded. They too had seen glimmers of humanity and surrender. The narrative became a private legend within the occupation forces, a story that softened the edges of guilt and exhaustion, reminding them that the war's purpose had been to end brutality, not to perpetuate it. For the Japanese prisoners, the match carried different meaning. To them, it had been both confession and resistance, not rebellion against the Americans, but against the despair that threatened to consume them. Wrestling had offered them structure, ritual, and a link to home at a time when identity itself was dissolving. After the surrender, some were transferred to the mainland, to camps near Tokyo and Yokohama, where they continued to hold small sumo bouts under American supervision. The matches were less about strength than about continuity, a symbolic gesture that Japan could still stand on its feet even as it knelt politically. As the occupation formalized under General Douglas MacArthur, American cultural officers took note of Japan's traditional arts. They saw in them tools for moral and psychological reconstruction. Baseball, democracy, and Shinto were all reinterpreted to serve a new vision of a peaceful Japan. Within that framework, the memory of the Okinawan Sumo exhibition quietly aligned with the narrative of reconciliation, though never officially acknowledged. A few military photographers who had documented the match kept their negatives. One was rumored to have filed them with a batch of routine camp inspection photos. Another supposedly mailed a print to his family in Kansas, captioned simply, "POW Wrestling Show." These images, if they ever surface, would be among the rarest documents of the Pacific War, not of violence or surrender, but of empathy. As Japan rebuilt under occupation, sport became an unexpected bridge between conqueror and conquered. American soldiers introduced basketball and boxing. Japanese athletes, in turn, taught judo, kendo, and the precise etiquette of sumo. The first post-war public sumo tournament in Tokyo in late 1946 drew not only Japanese civilians, but also American officers and their families. Some of them had heard rumors of the Okinawa match and came out of curiosity. Watching the rikishi stomp and bow, they were struck by how ritualized respect could coexist with raw power. The spiritual core of sumo, its calm before the clash, its insistence on purity, mirrored the broader moral rehabilitation that Japan was undergoing. In a sense, the sumo of peace in Okinawa had been an early rehearsal for that transformation. It had shown, in miniature, that Japan's identity could be expressed through strength without aggression, through pride without militarism. The American officers who had witnessed it perhaps sensed this intuitively, even if they could not articulate it in policy. As Reconstruction accelerated, Okinawa remained under U.S. control, a liminal space between defeat and sovereignty. The island's people lived among ruins, their lives framed by the presence of American bases. Yet oral traditions persisted. Fishermen and former laborers spoke of the prisoners' match, embellishing details, adding myth to memory. Some said the Americans had built a real wooden ring. Others claimed the Japanese wrestlers had been rewarded with extra rice. The truth blurred into folklore. By the 1950s, Japan's economy began to stir, its society rapidly modernizing under American influence. Sumo, however, retained its sacred weight, a thread connecting post-war Japan to its ancestral spirit. Magazines in Tokyo occasionally published human interest stories about sportsmanship during the war. One obscure 1953 article in Asahi Sports mentioned an incident of friendly sumo between soldiers and POWs on a southern island. The author, likely a returning soldier, used it as a parable of reconciliation, though no specific names or locations were given. Historians later speculated that this reference pointed directly to Okinawa. Meanwhile, in the United States, the veterans who had served there grew older. Many joined veterans' associations where memories of the Pacific blended with myth. During reunions, a few spoke about the day they saw Japanese prisoners wrestling. Their wives and children listened in surprise. It was not the kind of war story they expected. Some veterans even brought faded photographs or sketches, evidence of a moment that defied the logic of the battlefield. Academic interest in such episodes emerged decades later. In the 1970s and 1980s, as historians began to reassess wartime propaganda and the psychology of combat, the Okinawa Sumo story resurfaced in interviews and memoirs. One notable mention appeared in a 1976 oral history collection compiled by a Marine chaplain, where an unnamed corporal recalled a group of Japs wrestling in the yard and us cheering them like a ball game. Though brief, the account matched other fragmentary reports. What made this story endure was not its spectacle, but its symbolism. In a war that had been defined by dehumanization, here was an instant of reversal. The match had reduced the ideological distance between foes to a contest of balance and endurance, the very principles that sumo venerates. It suggested that respect could survive even in captivity, that sport could reveal a shared moral language when diplomacy had failed. In the broader cultural imagination of post-war Japan, the sumo of peace could easily have become a national myth, but it did not. Japan was preoccupied with survival, reconstruction, and the American occupation's strict censorship of wartime narratives. Stories of dignity among POWs risked being misunderstood as glorifying defeat. Thus, the memory remained local, carried quietly among those who had seen it. For the Americans, too, the episode fit awkwardly within official history. The U.S. military narrative of victory did not easily accommodate moments of cultural intimacy with the enemy. The Okinawa match, therefore, lived only in the margins, in veterans' recollections, in scattered diary entries, and in the subtle influence it exerted on post-war American perceptions of Japan. By the 1960s, as Japan emerged as an economic powerhouse and cultural ally, the relationship between the two nations softened. Sumo tournaments were broadcast internationally. American television viewers saw, perhaps for the first time, that Japan's oldest sport was not primitive ritual, but complex choreography of respect. A few journalists traced this fascination back to wartime encounters, though few could verify details. The legend of the Okinawa bout persisted as a ghostly precedent, the first unofficial cross-cultural exchange between American soldiers and Japanese athletes. When American bases in Okinawa celebrated anniversaries or held cultural festivals, sumo exhibitions occasionally appeared on the program. Local elders would nod knowingly, murmuring that it had all started long ago, right after the battle. The younger generation barely believed them, but each retelling kept the spark alive. The more historians studied the Pacific War, the more they realized how extraordinary the event had been. Sumo was not simply entertainment. It had survived even the militarization of Japan because it represented something older than empire, the balance of nature and will. When the prisoners performed it before their captors, they reclaimed a spiritual identity that no surrender could erase. In turn, the Americans, who had fought to the brink of madness on that same island, witnessed something that reawakened their own humanity. In that fragile intersection lay a kind of redemption. The Okinawa match did not change the course of history. It did not alter the politics of occupation or erase the trauma of war. Yet, for those present, it redefined what victory and defeat could mean. It proved that culture, when stripped of propaganda, could heal in ways treaties could not. The sumo of peace thus became more than anecdote. It became metaphor. It encapsulated the post-war paradox, a conquered nation regaining dignity through the preservation of its traditions, and a victorious power discovering humility through respect. As the years advanced and the century neared its close, memory began to loosen its grip on the survivors of the Pacific War. Yet every so often, the old story would resurface, whispered at a veterans' gathering, mentioned briefly in a newspaper column, or recalled by a Japanese scholar interviewing former prisoners. The Okinawa Sumo match, once a fleeting act of camaraderie on scorched soil, gradually transformed into a fragment of collective memory, one that neither country officially recorded, but both somehow preserved. In Japan's archives, a handful of documents hinted at its reality. A letter discovered in 1984, written by a former Imperial Navy officer held on Okinawa, described a day when we were allowed to perform sumo to honor peace. The letter, addressed to his son, contained no details of names or dates, but the phrasing matched oral accounts. Around the same time, an American historian working on prisoner-of-war relations stumbled upon photographs mislabeled as camp recreation activities. Among them was a blurry frame showing men in loincloths grappling inside a rough circle, while soldiers stood around laughing and clapping. The quality was poor, the provenance uncertain, but it stirred speculation. As post-war generations in both nations sought meaning and reconciliation, artists and filmmakers began reimagining such stories. In the late 1990s, a small Japanese television documentary featured reenactments of sports between enemies, a baseball game in the Philippines, a judo demonstration in Guam, and finally, a brief segment about Okinawa's mysterious sumo match. It lasted only 2 minutes, using narration and still images, yet it sparked renewed curiosity. Viewers were fascinated by the idea that even in defeat, Japan's warriors had expressed their identity through ritual rather than resentment. Historians began to view the episode through broader lenses. It fit within a growing body of research on how traditional culture persisted in wartime captivity, not as propaganda, but as survival strategy. For Japanese POWs, sumo offered discipline, unity, and a tangible link to the moral order of home. For the Americans, witnessing it served as an early exercise in cultural diplomacy, occurring years before formal reconciliation. Both sides, unknowingly, had participated in a prototype of what the modern world would later call soft power. By the early 2000s, Okinawa's tourism board, eager to balance its identity as both battlefield and bridge, included the story in a local exhibition on peace through culture. Visitors could see replicas of wartime camps, displays of sports equipment made from salvaged materials, and a plaque summarizing the sumo of peace. Though details remained speculative, the symbolism was powerful. School children visiting the exhibit learned that even in the darkest times, people had sought connection rather than vengeance. Veterans who attended, quietly, wept. Meanwhile, in the United States, academic interest in cross-cultural empathy during war expanded. A few articles in journals of military history reference the Okinawa match as a rare instance of moral improvisation, a small act of humanity that foreshadowed the broader transformation of U.S.-Japanese relations. What had begun as a rumor among guards now stood as metaphor for the evolution from enemy to ally. The last eyewitnesses faded one by one, but the story survived through the institutions that most valued ritual, sumo stables in Tokyo. Some retired wrestlers, hearing of the legend, began to speak of their predecessors who had served in the military. They noted how even during wartime, sumo had never ceased completely. Tournaments had been held under blackout conditions, and wrestlers had performed morale shows for troops. The Okinawa bout, they argued, was an extension of that continuity, proof that the spiritual essence of the sport had endured unbroken. In 2015, on the 70th anniversary of the war's end, a Japanese cultural foundation sponsored a commemorative sumo event in Naha, Okinawa's capital. It was held not in a stadium, but in an open-air courtyard built near the site of an old military camp. Before the match began, organizers read aloud the words of that 1945 letter, "We wrestled not for victory, but to remember who we were." As the wrestlers bowed and stomped in the sand, American visitors from the nearby base joined the applause. For a brief moment, the boundary between past and present blurred. The same earth that once soaked in blood now trembled under the rhythm of ancient ritual. In modern Japan, the story of the Sumo of peace endures less as a confirmed fact than as a moral fable. It encapsulates the dual nature of Japan's post-war rebirth, the tension between humility and pride, memory and progress. It speaks to how identity can survive occupation not through defiance, but through quiet dignity. To Americans, it offers a mirror of compassion, evidence that even amid total war, humanity persisted in unexpected forms. Though historians continue to debate its exact details, few doubt its emotional truth. The photographs, letters, and testimonies converge toward one simple image: two men, stripped to the waist, bowing to each other in the dust, while soldiers, both victors and vanquished, watch in silence. It is the kind of scene that needs no caption, no language, no ideology. It belongs to the universal memory of reconciliation. Today, when visitors walk through Okinawa's memorial parks and peace museums, they find plaques dedicated to the soldiers and civilians who perished, to the nurses, to the schoolchildren, to the farmers. There is no monument yet for the sumo wrestlers of 1945, but perhaps that is fitting. Their legacy lives not in stone, but in the invisible understanding they left behind. That culture, even broken by war, can bind enemies through shared respect. If the 20th century was defined by total conflict, then perhaps its most enduring redemption lies in small gestures like that one. A circle drawn in the dust, two bowing figures, and the applause of those who once stood on opposite sides of history. In the silence that followed each bout, long before treaties were signed and governments reconciled, there existed for a heartbeat the truest kind of peace, the peace that begins not with surrender, but with recognition.